All right, well, we are going to talk about building trusted teams, and there's always a bit of a story around that. For those of you who haven't run across me before, yeah, my name is Richard Campbell. I wrote my first line of code in 1977, which is not the most important thing that happened in 1977. The most important thing is Star Wars, right? Let's have our priorities straight. And that was on a TRS-80 Model 1. 4K RAM, cassette tape player, 127 by 47 graphic resolution, and a version of BASIC not made by Microsoft. It was actually a tiny BASIC, and it only had 3 error messages. What? How? And sorry. The most Canadian of error messages. Actually, I think it's still the best error message, because, I mean, what is object not found but sorry? Most folks know me from podcasting and things like that, but I have run a number of companies, done a few startups. One of them, Strange Loop Networks. I'm going to talk about some of the things we did around trust and culture at Strange Loop. It's one of the few startups I've actually started from scratch. I'm the guy you sort of bring into a company at a certain stage when you want to evolve it further. I did that role for a company called Telerik, you may have heard of. So I sat on their board from 2006 to 2012, and then they sold to Radware. We sold Strange Loop Networks to Radware. We sold Telerik to Progress. And I'm still involved with different startup companies. One of them is called Signal FM, and we are working to try and make podcasting better. So my regular workday is not normal. I wouldn't put me in an office. I'm kind of difficult to get along with. But I advise a lot of companies, and so topics like trust and things are very important to me, how you work with teams. Obviously, the podcast, the .NET Rocks listeners? All right, so, you know. My friend Carl Franklin started .NET Rocks back in 2002, and we're at 1,656 episodes as of last week, I guess. So I came on show 100, so I'm the new guy, right? We've been in a groove. I also started, for the IT Pro side, Run as Radio back in 2007. So we published a show a week every Wednesday since April 11th, 2007. So I'm fairly persistent. That's all you know for sure. And for that brief time when we weren't sure if .NET rocked, we made a show called The Tablet Show, right? Right after Build in 2011, when Microsoft did a show for developers where they never talked about .NET. And we came out of that and went, huh, and we built a backup show that was sort of iOS, Android, tablet, and so forth, until it became apparent that .NET did rock, and then we rolled that into .NET Rocks. But this particular talk actually comes from another podcast. If folks invite me to come on a podcast as a guest, I say yes, because I just can't live with that level of hypocrisy. You know, you consider I've asked several thousand people to be on a podcast over the past 15 years. Someone's going to think I have anything interesting to say, then I'm going to say yes. So the SQL data partners guys asked me, could you come on the show? So to be a dev guy talking to DBAs about, we ended up talking about trust, actually, pretty much the whole show. And then, which was fun. Then the PASS conference folks pinged me and said, hey, we heard this podcast you made and we really liked it. You think you could make it into a talk for PASS? I'm like, I've never talked at PASS. Okay. So I didn't remember what I said. So I listened to the show. Apparently I'm clever. And made a talk, this version of talk, although I've polished it a few times from there. So that's the origins of it. Because I don't feel like anybody's really an expert in trust. Like, what does that even mean, to be an expert in trust? I have some experience. I've been doing this for a while. And so certainly I thought a lot about it. It drives me. When I talk about real reference or real education, 3 books that I committed to memory, and I would hope you would read them too. And I'll throw this back up at the end if you want to get these books if you don't already have them. Starting with the middle one, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, been around forever. Still good thinking. I remember listening to this driving down to Microsoft, and just that whole, it sort of breaks down into 2 sections. Your personal development, things like being proactive and beginning and the end in mind and doing first things first. And then your team interactions, the thinking win-win, seeking first to understand, and synergizing, taking advantage of everyone's differences to make 1 + 1 = 3. And the 7th habit, which arguably we're doing right now, they call sharpening the saw. Right, that idea that once in a while we have to take some time to sharpen the saw, to add to our skills. I really like conferences as a way to take a moment out of your work and say, am I going the direction I want to go in? Am I working on the things I want to work on, right? It's a contemplative time. And you have this sort of buffet in front of you, things you can learn about, things you can explore, and think, should I have more of that in my life, right? The line sharpening saw coming from, some guy cutting down a tree, working hard, and somebody comes along and says, why didn't you sharpen the saw? And he goes, I'm too busy cutting down the tree. Yeah, more to it than that. More modern book, not that I have anything wrong with Covey, but Drive by Daniel Pink is one of my favorite analyses of how thought workers actually think. There's an RSA video, I think, that captures this really well, but it comes to this idea that once the basic expenses are paid, once someone's making a viable living, money is no longer a motivator. I mean, I would go a step further, because I've seen this in organizations where money actually becomes toxic. You can't keep paying people more and expect them to go faster as soon as it's anything other than sort of a mechanical kind of work. Which begs the question, how does an employer motivate workers if not by money? And that's what Drive really gets into, is these three core concepts of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy being that people want to work on what they want to work on. They want choice in how they work. And mastery, that they want to press against the edges of the skills, that they actually want to get better. And purpose, that they're working on something more important than a paycheck. That they're working on stuff that's meaningful. And I've never met a developer that didn't have care for autonomy, mastery, and purpose. My best proof point is you can't get a developer to just work on software and never deploy it. Right? They're miserable. They actually care that their software gets used, that there's a purpose more than just writing the code, that the code must actually be run. That's important too. We care about purpose. And certainly autonomy and mastery is, can you press against the edges of the skills, can you explore new things, can you go different ways. Last of the three here, Powerful Engagement, a little more of a contemporary book, and the argument they make in essence is that we all have the same amount of time, that being productive is not about time management, it's actually about energy management. And so the idea that it is more important to get sleep than it is to code all night. Heresy, I know, but that how you manage recharging your batteries, understanding how you as a person gain strength and energy to have a productive day, and making sure you incorporate that into your routine. Very prescient to the current big conversation around burnout. That, energy management is actually what we're all about. So I'm going to anchor in these three books, but not necessarily talk about them per se. They'll keep coming up, because we're really here to talk about trust. So we better define it, because it's a vague thing. We all think about it, right? Humans at their essence are social creatures, and to be social is to have some level of trust. In the end, humans are somewhat dangerous. Why would you go near them, right? So what is trust actually? Trust is this shared sense of value and beliefs. I would argue that even though you may not know many of the people in this room, you trust them more than the average person on the street, because by being in this room, you already have a sense of some of their values and beliefs. They're here, after all. This is a place they had to ask to come to or spent money to be at, took time away from work to be at. That speaks to a value that you probably share. And actually, the way we actually grow trust is to learn more about each other's values and beliefs and come to appreciate them, think that they're important. Because the more I understand you, the more you will trust me that I value those things, that I care about those things. We're looking for a way to feel safe in a group. And safe is a funny concept, right? Especially when we think about work. I mean, this is in the United States. We're not particularly worried about people running around in their offices shooting people. That seems to be a hobby they've got nailed, right? Let's not do it here. We don't do it in Canada. It doesn't seem like any fun. But safe at work means more than that, right? That I can express an opinion and not expect to be stepped on. That I can make a mistake and continue to go on. And it's not required. You can create your own sense of safety, right? You can build those walls around you and still be a productive, contributing member of a team. You're just not as productive. The most productive teams I've ever worked with in any organizations, either as a consultant or as a member of them, had a really high level of trust. You've all had that experience of a group of people you knew had your back. And so you could push the envelope, you could make experiments, you could move fast and break things. You weren't afraid to fail. And that, I think, is the biggest force in most organizations right now, is a fear of failure, or more relevantly, a fear of the consequences of failure. So when I'm working in a consulting role coming into an organization, I pretty quickly go up the tree, sort of look at senior leadership and look at their reactions to failure. You know, if anything being down for 15 minutes is a career-ending moment, well, that's a pretty high level of fear most people are operating at. I suspect they're not being too keen to take any chances that might represent an outage of any kind. How does this organization respond to failure? Because failure is kind of inevitable, and operating in a space where you're not allowed to fail significantly limits your ability to maneuver. Essentially, stresses the trust, limits the trust. You can't have my back because we're not allowed to fail, right? And it can get more toxic than that, right? It's the old, I don't have to run faster than a bear, I just have to run faster than you, right? If one of us fails and it's not me, then I'm good. So we want a space that we can actually fail in and are not afraid to fail in. And when we don't have it, we try and make it. It doesn't have to be the whole organization. It would be nice if it was. And often when I talk to leadership, they don't have a whole lot of problem with that until we actually start manifesting the consequences of failure in meaningful ways. And then when the details come out, it's a little harder. But I've also seen teams in a very cautious or risk-averse organization that operated with a fair high level of trust and performance because there was folks there that were willing to deal with the failure issues. They were willing to take that on. They had that clout. They knew that value. They knew how to make those arguments to keep functioning. Another real challenge to trust in most organizations, especially technical organizations, is loyalty to a product. Loyalty to a product is a way to make everyone else other. Right? I started on a podcast about with some SQL Server folks, right? And there's a schism between the DBAs and the developers. I'm a SQL Server guy, as opposed to what he really is, which is a steward of the data of the organization. I'm a C# guy, when what you really are is someone who creates features in products that improve the value of the company, right? When we step away from the products and we look at the real value proposition we bring to organizations, then we get closer to an alignment that in the end, the only measure that actually matters at all is how we bring customer value. Now, if we're tech people, and I bet most of us are, we're at least one order removed from direct customer value. We're rarely the salesperson. We rarely directly interact with someone who's going to give us money. We tend to build and operate tools that allow others to be productive in providing value to customers, which is fine as long as you know that chain, so that the thing I build or care and feed leads to other people being able to be more effective in providing customer value. If you don't know how your organization makes money, how do you know you're providing value? So for me as a consultant, it's an easy question for me to ask and quickly realize, like, we're gonna have a tough time being aligned on something that all of us should be working together on if we actually don't know the kind of essence of how a business is actually functioning. And when you do know that, you get to be able to carve out a little trust, because you know senior leadership cares a lot about customer value. So when you can take your team and show how they provide value and how additional resources will provide more value, well, often you can find budget that way, right? You're going to engender trust in leadership when you show that your team is aligned to customer value. And leadership's a funny word because it is an activity rather than an actual attribute per se. We do talk about natural leaders. I don't think it's true. I think leadership can be appointed, but following is not. So leaders naturally emerge, right? They're the folks that tend to be going in a direction we find vaguely appealing for whatever reason. Someone you trust, has a vision of a direction, they may end up being a leader. Now that's very different from authority, because authority is something granted, right? Authority is put upon you. And those two things together, leadership and authority, they're very different. And depending on your culture, they have different weights. So, I mean, I'm speaking as a Canadian who often talks to Americans, and they look at leadership and authority differently than, say, Eastern Europeans. I'm pretty comfortable being in Australia. Like, I think we're not that far removed from that. That Western culture tends to be somewhat anti-authoritarian. We tend to push back on folks that have authority and look more towards the leaders, whether they have authority or not. Because we always have a mixture of two. Everyone has some degree of authority. After all, you are a part of a company. And everyone has a certain amount of ability to lead, whether or not they're leading or not. The more interesting one, let me add the third aspect, is influence. And certainly in Western culture, I think we value influence very highly for the simple reason that it is actually a skill that you can cultivate and exercise independently of authority and leadership. You can be granted no authority at all within an organization, or effectively none, and you may not be in a role to lead at all and yet still have influence. And actually, if you take those three things together, you find, A, we always have a mixture of them, and we have to use the mixture of them as well. And it's worth cultivating each one. So I've met plenty of folks that are influential and often end up in roles of leadership. You're the person who strikes out in direction and people go with you. You have influenced someone and are effectively leading, authority or not. And actually, many of the best leaders I've met who have authority are extremely hesitant to use it. They'd rather influence. Because typically, when you try and lead a team with authority, because I'm in charge, we will do X, you get inferior results to the energy to influence a team to want to go in that direction. Does that make sense? The difference between those? I just like thinking about all three because they're always present. Be careful with authority. It's usually poisonous, at least in this culture. I mean, in other parts of the world, I've had huge pushback on that with lots of folks that prefer authority. I don't think it's this culture, I'm guessing, but I'm a good guesser. And if you're thinking about all of these things, you realize that every one of them, for trust, leadership, influence, authority, they all come down to communication. How well do we communicate? And you will never find anyone building trust successfully that isn't communicating. In fact, I would argue that generally speaking at work, you can't really improve trust without communicating, and communicating work is very hard, right? Typically because we're working with constrained mediums. So let's go through some technical ways to communicate. And I'll do them in a bit of a hierarchy. Like we'll start with instant messenger, right? Now what do we like about instant messenger? Well, it's short, so I don't have to pay too much attention. It's asynchronous, so again, non-interrupting. I can respond when I want to respond. And non-interrupting. Right? It doesn't bother me, so I can turn that little beep-doop off, right? And choose to read it when I want to read it, respond to it when I want to read it. I like all those things. But it's not a great communication medium. It's pretty short. It's hard to get tone. That's why there's emojis. Not that I like emojis, right? And the one thing I've learned about communicating is if a medium's not working for you, if it's not getting better, change the medium. Widen the bandwidth, right? Instant message actually counts on a high level of trust between individuals to communicate anything of any significance. That's why it's good between friends, right? We already have a fairly high level of trust with our friends. We take their limited range of communication and messaging positively. We forgive spelling mistakes. We don't look grossly upon them for spelling you with just a U. But you could move up to email, because email is a better communication form. Here's my rule with email. If the response email was longer than the original email, you're failing, right? I write a paragraph, you respond with 2 paragraphs. I come back with 4 paragraphs, you nail me with 16. Like, you bet I'm not. It's like, if I just agree with you, do I still have to read this? That's a failing email chain. If it's, the perfect email chain gets shorter, right? The last email is okay or thanks. If it's getting longer, change the medium. Medium's not working, right? So we can go to the telephone. I don't know why anybody would. The telephone, I mean, both email and instant messenger had the features of being asynchronous, non-interrupting. Now, as soon as you hop to the telephone, you're synchronous and you're interrupting. I mean, think about what a ringing telephone actually means. What it actually means is, whatever you're doing, stop and talk to me. Now, I've come to appreciate there is no phone calls in my life that I want that aren't on my schedule. And every time I answer the phone, not knowing who it is because they're not on my schedule and there's a little reminder pointed up, I'm sad. Because inevitably after a moment, I'm like, this was not more important than what I was doing. Ever. Leave a voicemail. I'll not listen to that either. And you can escalate beyond the phone call, right? You can get to the conference call, which is exactly as obnoxious as a phone call, except first you spend 15 minutes making everybody angry by trying to make it work. Then have the meeting. But it is more bandwidth. I mean, upside of synchronicity is hopefully you have attention. Hopefully. If everyone's on a laptop during the meeting, maybe not. You know, I really got into tablets because I realized as soon as I had a screen up like this in front of me, I wasn't in the meeting anymore. If it was laying down on the table, I was. Like that physical barrier mattered in terms of how people interacted with you. Now, get rid of the technology entirely. Go to the old-fashioned one-on-one, face-to-face meeting. This is arguably the best possible communication form we can, right? We've got our full bandwidth available. We can see each other, we can smell each other, we can watch our facial inflections, all of those tones, right? Those are all an effective way to communicate. It takes longer, takes more planning, but it's more effective. Now, but there is a level of communication higher still. That level is pizza. Pepperoni pizza, fine. Maybe vegetarian pizza. I'm in Australia. How do you feel about ham and pineapple? Okay, right. Or the olives and anchovies? All right, I got a bunch of weirdos here. Get that. Actually, pizza's, well, for starters, why am I talking about this? Look, humans are hardwired to trust those they break bread with. You're triggering a very visceral part of the brain when you eat with someone. It helps trust automatically, right? Take away all the technology and all the trappings, get back to those Stone Age folks, and when we shared food, it was a resource that was constrained. I'm taking something expensive and sharing it with you. It doesn't quite look the same in modern times, but the essence is there, and it's safe. We're safe enough from predators that we can consume food, we can be vulnerable. When I'm talking to team leaders, I ask them about their lunches. Most of the time at work, we're stressing trust. We're challenging trust. We're exercising trust. There's only a few times where you actually get to grow trust. Recognize that growing trust is sharing values and beliefs. And lunch is one of the few times in a regular workday where you can do that. And it also happens to be in a state where you're receptive to it. Plan your lunches. If you're responsible for leading a team or you realize you need to improve trust, every single lunch is precious. And you may start with just your team. There's a good state in team. In fact, one of the best measures I have of healthy teams is they like to eat together. I've actually been in organizations where we invited another team to come in to have lunch with us, and they refused. Free pizza. That's crazy, but it actually spoke to, this is how low the level of trust is right now. Right? That it's not a casual or minor thing. Like, this is very serious. We should work on this. Getting your team to a point that they trust themselves with each other is great. And the size of the lunch matters. If everybody can't hear everybody else, then it gets pretty hard, right? So much beyond a table for 6 or 8, it's really tough to do the thing of, it's nice to eat the food, but the goal was to communicate, right? And communicate in an optimal form. We're trying to grow trust here, not feed people pizza. But You got to find a format that actually works. And I like the different pizzas just because you should know what people like as food. You know, it kills me the idea that we had a team that a year into working together, we finally found out one of them was a vegetarian and had never eaten a single thing we'd ever ordered. And we never noticed. Find out what pizza people like. Or what they like, period, right? Food-wise. It's part of a culture, right, that we care about these things. Now, you can do a lot with lunch. You could turn them into lunch and learns if you want. The big thing I would say is manage the time carefully. There's only so much time in a lunch and learn. And if you spend the whole time watching a video and not talking, you've missed the point. The point was to talk, right? So make sure whatever they need to watch or engage with is short enough that leaves time to converse about it. I'd also think the way you present information in a lunch and learn is super important. Present it as an idea from outside that we get to discuss the merits of. Not, I think we should do this, or this is the right way for X, or we should be switching to this. If you already come with an opinion, you've essentially betrayed a trust because you've given up on the idea of, I want to share a value with you, right? I want to see if we match. You're not going to grow any trust with dictatorial lunch and learns. You grow trust with ideas that we can explore together so that we see that we think the same way about something or that we're affected by something. I'm not expecting everyone to agree all the time, but I don't like teams where everyone agrees all the time. They don't make as good work. Best teams I've ever seen disagreed about stuff respectively and found better ideas that they could consolidate on. It's like tempering steel. It takes a little bit of heat. Not too much. You don't want to melt the sword, but enough. Right? Constructive heat. I also liked bringing in other teams. When my team was functioning well, let's start interacting with the other teams. It's a bigger organization. We do lunch and learns where we were teaching each other about each other's jobs. Get the networking team to come in and show you how the network works, what their failover strategies are. Well, plus letting you know there's actually a network, right? There's lots of web developers who are like, there's a browser, there's a cloud thing, then there's a web server, and sometimes there's a database behind it. And you've consolidated the network guy's job to the line between the cloud thing and the web server, right? There's some stuff in there, and it's important. And so having them come and show it to you and walk you through it, and same thing, walk them through how a feature gets developed. The goal I was looking for as someone helping teams to trust each other more was to come out the other side of that going, wow, your job's hard. Because that's the real problem, right? Is that we think the other jobs are trivial, and they're not. That's why they have to do them. If they're trivial, they'd be automated. We'd get rid of them, and they're not, right? We need them. It's hard work, all of it. And when you get a chance to teach someone something, be excited about it. I love this XKCD comic for it because it speaks to this idea of how great it is to have an opportunity to teach someone something, to be delighted at that moment when you can say, hey, wait till you learn about this, you're going to love it. By that same token, I think one of the poisons we have in the technical industry especially is the word easy. How many times has you've asked about a problem, hey, I'm trying to figure out how to build this thing. Don't worry, it's easy. Now, what has he really said when he says that? A, you're dumb. And B, my work is trivial. Right? And it's also a lie. Virtually nothing we do is easy. Once you understand it, it's easy to forget how much effort you did to learn it. Just banish it from your language. It just hurts everyone. Hey, this is really cool. Took me a while to figure it out. I'll help you through it. It'll be good. Don't worry. Enjoy. Right? Here we go. Don't trivialize your efforts and don't trivialize their need to understand it. Don't say easy. Do more with it. I don't have a lot of use for trust exercises. I just don't think it works in the technical fields. I'm sure there's a group of people somewhere that think this is fun. They're just nobody I know, okay? But there are things we can do outside of work, the regular work. Like I've already got the lunches figured out. That's a good thing. But how do we go further afield? And this is when we talk about culture. Culture is something you make, but also something you find. So at Strange Loop, Most of our developers work from home. It was their best development in space. It saved us money as a startup from having huge offices. And we got together every Friday to do code reviews en masse. And sort of that was our end of week scrum, plan the next week and so forth, right? We had a Slack chat system that was essentially an IRC server, but it worked really well for us. And that was how we stayed in communication routinely. But every Friday, everyone would come in and I would feed them with way too much food, right? And it was that, I was big on what do you like, what don't you like? And we had a certain number of vegetarians and so forth. It's like sometimes we're doing Indian and sometimes, we're just doing sandwiches and so forth. But one of the things I saw that came out of my culture that wasn't a big a deal to me was I had several people that hated wasted food. It was they literally were going to walk out. It's like, hey, is everyone done eating? I'm going to take this down to the homeless shelter. Right? They didn't want to waste the food. They were going to be gone for 20 minutes. They're going to take the food to the homeless shelter. So pretty quickly I figured out, this is an important part of it. Let's just build it into our schedule. That, I always want to have more food than necessary. I don't want anybody ever to go hungry. But let's make sure the food goes somewhere that's important. And as I saw that aspect of the culture, I thought, is there a team building exercise here? Is there something we could do that related to the values we had? And so I actually signed us up for a food bank. I don't know, are these around in Australia? You know what I'm talking about with a food bank? Places we donate food and canned goods and so forth, and then they organize them into typical weekly bundles for folks who need more food. I'll tell you why I love a food bank. Dullest job in the world, right? I mean, your average software developer is going to quickly figure out how many cans of lima beans to go in a box. But you didn't actually want the activity to be engaging. You want it to be meaningful. We're doing something that relates to our culture, but boring enough that they started talking to each other, which was actually the goal, right? So here we are sharing a value that we're helping people who need more food and at the same time getting to know each other better. That worked really well. Did the same thing for soup kitchens, right? It was Canadian Thanksgiving. So doing Thanksgiving as a group, that we would work a soup kitchen for a night. Again, you know how much gravy you need to put on. Not that hard a job, but it gave time. We shared a value. Every organization is different. What do you like? What don't you like? We had a group of folks that really liked cycling to work, right? Vancouver, we're very, into the environment thing. And so putting in a shower so they were able to clean up and helping to organize weekend rides and things. It was never a thing I wanted to do, but it was certainly important to them. And I liked cultivating that culture, and it made a really strong set of teams. I tried Habitat for Humanity too, same sort of thing. I actually, have experience in electrical wiring, so I was useful. They were surprised. I'm usually not that useful. Although it kind of kills me to watch a really good programmer just paint the fence. I mean, they're doing something good, right? Although this was a weekend thing, and that's hard, right? I mean, people have lives. It's like you've been working all week, and now you're going to go on Saturday to build somebody else's house. Really? So pretty quickly I figured out that the folks that that couldn't come were the ones with families. So what do? Not do it? I brought in child minding. Here's the deal. Go to your spouse, say, hey, I'm going to do this weekend thing at Habitat for Humanity. I'm taking the kids. It's like, you get a weekend off. You're like, really? That's a pretty good deal. Sometimes they came too, right? Because everybody wants to paint a fence. But just understanding the culture. I had a culture of younger developers who had families. And so if you just started including child minding in everything we were doing, it's not that expensive, but it's also understanding what's important to my people. Raise the level of trust. Right? And I would also say this. Then we started doing big barbecues and things together, which I certainly like. Again, included child minding. It's not that the parents weren't both there. It's that all they're going to do is one of them at least is going to take care of their kids the whole time. So paying for a couple of professional child minders and face painters and things, it just wasn't that much for the fact that their kids had a great time and they got to engage. And I'd also suggest this. You ever get into a situation with a bunch of employees where you also have their significant other there, make a point of thanking them. I don't care if you're a startup company or a Fortune 500 company or anything like that. Every family makes a decision on who goes to work at your company. Thank them for that. Your company's better for it. It's just an acknowledgement, right? That this is a valuable thing. It raises trust too, but it happens to be a nice thing to do, and that's useful. We didn't do a lot of those. We ended up doing more of the food bank stuff. It was easy. It was local. The folks enjoyed it. It really wasn't that like they literally started making agendas for what they're going to do at the food bank. I really want to work through this problem while we're together packing boxes. Okay. Actually, problem solving offsite I think is pretty valuable, but I'm pretty careful with offsites in general. Not too fun, right? The goal of the offsite was not to have a good time. Not too many people either. Generally, only people who need to make a decision. Also, no easy decisions. I made offsites suck just enough that you had to really care about the problem to want to go on it. The big one for me, and it's easy because it's British Columbia, was out of cell range. It's going to be 6 of us. We're out of cell range, and the agenda has one item on it, the one we have not been able to solve for 6 months. Because if you put easy items, they're going to do those and leave that one to the end, right? Everybody wants the easy win. No easy wins on offsites. You want easy wins? Do them in the office. We only do offsites when it's going to suck, right? And you've got to do it away from distraction and fight through it. And if you can't get that done, you got nothing. That was the only way to crack the hardest nuts, was with those kinds of settings. They tended to be in the forest, in the woods, with bears outside. A little bit about remote working. In the earlier versions, I didn't have this, and it always was top question, because everybody has remote work. It's just kind of a normal reality today. In terms of just strengthening teams, if it's always one person that's on the phone and everybody else is together, I started asking other team members to go into their office and also be on the phone. Just so that we had the same bandwidth constraint. Not all the time, but at least some of the time, just to have some empathy for how hard it is to be on the phone versus in the room. And same for folks that are further afield, right? They're never going to be able to come in, or it's rare to ever they're going to come in. How to engage them. I've really gotten into having coffee remote. When you're a remote worker, typically you're only on a call with something with an agenda, right? Or you're pursuing a particular person to answer a particular question to get a particular task done. Taking 20 minutes to have the caffeinated beverage of your choice via videocast with no plan. Because it's something you do all the time with workers in your office, right? You both end up at the Starbucks and you just chat for a little while. You never do that with a remote worker. It's what's missing. Water cooler talk, right? Just that break. It's just, I would schedule a 20-minute, no plan coffee break. I'm going to get a cup of tea. You go get the beverage of your choice. Let's sit across the screen and just talk. Whatever it may be. Let's see if it doesn't shift things a little, right? That being said, with remote workers, I always want to bring them in at some point. It's very hard if you have a team and just a couple of people are remote and they never come in. I'm not saying all the time, but periodically. It's just got to be part of a plan. If you have a major remote group, like it's a development group that's external to you, whether it's owned by you or it's a major contract with you, I still like to occasionally trade members. Send one of our folks there for a week or two, send one of their folks back. The question is who? Who would you send in a circumstance like that to up the trust between the teams? What's the skill I'm looking for? It's influence, not authority. Now, often we send the most senior person, and they may not have that much influence, right? But it's the young, typically younger, enthusiastic, someone who knows the names of everybody's kids, right? Knows when everyone's birthday. Like, you know who I'm talking about. Send them. For a couple of reasons, in both directions. A, make sure they get on a call on the other side of the call. Just say, hey, now I'm over here. And also that enthusiasm, that interest, that influence, they share that when they get back, right? The trust they've got, they'll communicate it to the rest of the team and raise the trust as a whole. So it's the right person that goes to that. So the big thing is, don't make it a privilege. Don't make it a perk to have to travel. It's an obligation, and I want an influential person to do it. Do we have a culture that allows for mistakes? Because if you're working on trust, you're going to make mistakes. I never shy away from the meta. I'm talking about my intent here, right? I'm working with this team. I'm concerned with the level of trust in the team. I'm going to actively improve. I want to actively improve the trust of the team. Let me know how I'm doing. Let me know how you feel about this, right? Where it's at. And when I do something inappropriate, like when I was feeding everyone pizza except the vegetarian, you made a mistake, right? And you apologize. And you don't qualify the apology, like, and you should have told me. It's like, I should have known you're a vegetarian. I am sorry. That is a mistake on my part. I did that. And I'm going to be better. I promise. I'm trying hard to do a better job of it. No equivocation in apology. It costs you nothing. And it raises trust every time to be genuinely apologetic to anyone. Coworker, child, spouse. Apologies never hurt a person. They only made things better. All right. I don't want us to be too late today. I got a couple of calls of action. First off, taking time. Nothing I've talked about today happens fast. It needs to be blocked out. It needs to be on your schedule. I live in Outlook. I come to appreciate the only thing worse than Outlook is every other way to do email and scheduling. Whatever way you want to do it is fine. But if the only thing on your schedule is what other people want you to do, and garbage day, your schedule's not your friend. Block out your lunches, block out time for learning, block out time for thinking. Put stuff on your schedule that's good for you, not just your obligations. And recognizing that you have blocks of time that are specifically for strengthening trust. And that always means communicating, that you have to take time to communicate with folks, to block out enough time to truly communicate, and to also know when to walk away from a meeting. If that person's not in a place to communicate with you, don't waste their time, give it back, right? Communication is not a guaranteed success. If we're in a scenario like if there was just in a fire alarm or their child is sick and so forth, like that's a meeting you let go. Because only folks that are in a place where they're willing to communicate are going to be useful anyway. Spend some time on your own leadership. Hopefully you're doing that this week too. Most people manage their careers only. They rarely spend time to actually lead their career. Focus on the direction you're going in. And I hope you're sampling things at this show and just stuff you've never thought of before. And maybe it affects the direction you want to go in next. But also just that sort of, the nice thing when you do that leadership moment for yourself is like, this is the forest I want to go, and this is the one I want to be hacking through. It energizes you too. It just goes, yeah, this was the stuff I wanted to work on. And if it's not, that's energizing too. It's time to fix it. It's time to do something else. It takes me 2 weeks to actually get serious about my personal leadership. My wife makes me do this. We take 2-week vacations. It takes a week for the noise to stop in my head. I better remember to, and I write all that stuff down. After about a week, it stops. And then I actually start thinking, am I working on things I want to work on? What would I be doing differently? Now, I'm an OCD kind of guy. Like, I like doing 6, 7 different things. Like, if I do 2 things, same thing twice, 2 days in a row, except eating, I get bored, right? So everybody's different. But if you're not carving out time for your personal leadership, you're never going to be able to do this stuff. And if it isn't working, like if you realize you're in that situation, be nice to yourself too. We give a lot of slack to everyone else. We're really hard on ourselves. It's good to just go, hey, I'm not doing a good job on this. I need to get better at it. And then maybe put some stuff in the calendar. Do more of the reading on where do you want to go, what do you want to work on. I've never met someone who was that wasn't really influential that also didn't have a pretty good picture of what was important to them, because it's compelling. You're influential when you're excited about where you're going. Always making time to learn. I have the feature of I fly a lot. People ask me what I do on a plane. I read my Kindle a lot. Right? I knock out 50 to 100 books a year because I fly that much. So this year will be 180,000 miles flown. Right? That's where I read. Find a time to learn the way you want to learn. I'm a reader. I read fast. I find video boring, and I loathe podcasts. Wait. I can't listen to podcasts. I only hear the mistakes, right? I end up criticizing the whole time. It's one of my least favorite ways to actually learn stuff. I would much rather read something than hear it. It's just, that's me. You're different. However you like to consume knowledge, put on your schedule, consume it routinely. It's energizing. It makes you feel good, gets you thinking about new things. It's powerful. Part of that would be thinking in terms of roles. It's easy for us to think in terms of products, but when you actually think in terms of a role, it expands your horizons. It gives you new places to learn, new places to influence. I'm responsible for providing value to the company. What are other places I could be doing that in? What are the holes? What are the gaps? You want to be influential to leadership? Understand their business better than they do. All right? The nature of influence is eating around the edges. There's always an area of concern larger than your area of influence. That area of influence gets bigger when you press against the edges of it, whatever that may be. Putting energy into influence is about thinking about expanding your role, pressing against the edges of the role as it exists today. Gives you new opportunities, allows you to facilitate other people, engenders more trust. You share more values with more people. And ultimately, being vulnerable is a key part of trust, and I hate this game. But yeah, trust is a two-way street. Nobody's going to trust you if you don't trust anyone. And that means ultimately being vulnerable to them, whatever that looks like. You're going to run out of easy stuff to talk about over lunch fairly quickly if you do it for a long time. Then you start talking about hard stuff. Most people want to talk about that, right? We're generally not noise-oriented people, just want to talk about the weather. Trust is about being able to talk about harder things. So the vulnerability part comes into that. All right, 3 books back up, if you haven't already gotten them down, and we have a few minutes for questions, or you can escape for the day. It's the last session. Thank you so much for your time. And by the way, please put the cards in. That's how they let me come back to these things. So if you let them know that this is the kind of session you like, because it's a little off topic, I guess. I don't know, maybe not. We all deal with this in one degree or another. It just doesn't get talked about very much, but I care for these things. So if you want more of them, let them know, and I can keep doing stuff like this. Green. Oh yeah, well, let's go with the green ones. They seem to approve those. I know one time a speaker said, just put only red ones and let's freak them out, right? What happened in the room? What didn't I cover?
For me, the currency of trust is integrity.
Mm-hmm.
And it is consistency and honesty. However, I didn't hear you talk. You may have talked about.
Well, and I spoke of that as a term of values, because different people, different places, the value sets mean different. But I agree with you. Integrity, honesty, compassion, empathy more than sympathy, right? Understanding how people feel, and sort of walking them out of those shoes rather than just appreciating they feel differently than you. Those are all important values. I just sort of group them as values because different people want to express them different ways. So, but I appreciate the sentiment.
Another thing that I guess that a small comment on.
Sure.
Communication is very difficult, and you kind of glossed over that. You just said, "Let's earn trust by communicating."
Yes.
You only have so much time. I understand that.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak a little more about that?
Well, and without a doubt, the biggest thing is we don't make enough. We all have the same amount of time. We choose to allocate a limited amount of it to meaningful communication. And that's one of the reasons I specifically got out of the routine work communication parts, because rarely do those engender more trust. They tend to challenge that trust. At the best they validate it, they rarely grow it. Right? It does happen on occasion. When someone sees you clearly have their back, that's great. But it's why I like lunch, because it's long enough that you actually get an opportunity to get through the noise and actually talk about meaningful things. But there's no fast way. If you can't spend an hour with someone, don't. Maybe that's the thing I got to add. It's like, no 15-minute meetings, please. Nobody ever grew trust in a 15-minute unit. But an hour, you got a shot. Right? I've been doing interviews for the history of .NET. I don't know if you follow the show, I've been working on it. The 3-hour interview is by far the best format. Everybody's careful talking to me for the first hour. Nobody's careful by hour 3. But I think part of that is just when you take people back and put them in their comfort zone, you have that long conversation and you're reflecting their feelings, what you care about, and you put them back in a time, They actually want to talk about that time. But in that first hour, I have to grow enough trust to allow them to talk about those things. And they want to. And I think it's true of everyone. But none of it happens. You cannot do it on a schedule, right? It doesn't work an agenda item. You can get better at it. More, if this is something that Covey talks about in 7 Habits, is this reflecting people's feelings, acknowledging what they are when they're not dealing with facts, when they're actually dealing with how they feel, allows them to move through those things and get into more material. So definitely it's a skill, and it's well worth cultivating. Uli. Yes. I mean, the challenge there is the effective communication means. When you got someone who's underperforming, do they know they're underperforming? Do they agree that they're underperforming? I think you have to walk into that very slowly, that there is a metric for a level of performance. Our company average or our expectations is here. I see you working here. And get them bought into the measure before we talk about how we're going to improve it. And then, there is an improvement plan. Like, this comes down to you as the leader looking them in the eye and it's like, I know you can do this. Like, we want you in this. The easiest thing at all is to give up. I don't want to do that. I want us to get there. Right? I would also say this. I'm sure you've had this experience. The underperforming person you get performing has a remarkable level of trust too. Right? That moment where people recognize that you bet on them, that you may have valued them more than they value themselves, it's very powerful. It's one of the reasons it's worth working on that. Not only because you can look yourself in the eye that I tried hard to get that person where they want to go, it's also valuable when we succeed. But I also say I have, in many businesses, I'm often the guy who has to tell somebody they need to take the ball and go home. I mean, letting go of employees sucks too, but negotiating a partner out of a company, not fun. And I don't do it because I like it. I do it because I'm effective at it, and I would prefer we didn't screw it up. So I end up doing that. But there's very few people I've ever met in the world that are clueless enough that they know they don't have any idea that they're miserable and that they're not working well. And when you can actually open that up and see the truth, and sometimes the best thing is to go our separate ways. And I have said to someone perfectly, it's like, I know you hate me right now, but tomorrow's going to be a better day, whether you know it or not. And and maybe a month later they may contact me and go, yeah, okay. I had one I never spoke to again, and 10 years later came up to me in a conference and says, I don't even think you recognize me, and I hated you. But you were right. I hated my job, and I've gone on to other things. Right? It's taking on that emotional stuff and those hard things. Nobody wants to fail. And nobody goes to work each day thinking, today I'm really going to screw up. Right? They all have an intent, whether they articulate well or not. And we can hold that up. But again, it's not fast. Right? I think when we deploy systems too rigidly, too quickly, this is how things work, you are not achieving, let us move on to the next step. Like, therein lies the blunder. Right? You've got to have them bought in enough to even consider the idea that they need to improve. If they don't believe they need to improve and you're just being unfair to them, you're not going to get there. And that's more time. Sir. What I like about knowledge bases is that they're published, so they're equal, where every conversation could be customized to the individual. So when we're talking about, how we measure performance, how compensation is done, how vacations are done, and so forth, I kind of like the knowledge base because it's that written down format that says this is true for everyone, right? That being said, some people are just not good readers too, and if they don't understand it, it's not valuable. So helping people be sure they actually understand what the rules are, that's often why we want to pop out of that. Does that make sense? Okay. There's some, sir? Yes. Right. you use a different communication medium. So I always, if I'm going to initiate a communication, I start with an asynchronous, non-interrupting form. Messenger, email, start with that. You know, if I'm not getting a response, then I might escalate to a synchronous mode. But the same way I've never found a phone call in the past few years that I've wanted that wasn't on my schedule. Nobody else does either, right? So just not being hypocritical about it, it's like I get on their schedule. So the call's expected, it's coming. Maybe even look forward to. But it may only be like a half hour in advance, right? It's like, hey, I'm going to go get coffee in a bit. Did you want to join me? You know, okay if you don't, but if you do, and if they're, they're around, then a half hour lead time is probably enough. But yeah, big thing for me, I'm not inherently opposed to phone calls because voice communication has power. It's more effective than email. Just, if you're going to interrupt someone, ask nicely first, right? So it's not actually an interruption, it's planned. It's, oh boy, you're calling. Excellent. Big difference, right? Like that to me is the change. Get it on the schedule. Sir. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I tackle blame culture by finding out what the actual value proposition is. Like what is the consequence of blame? What are they trying to avoid? You know, why are they going there? And then making sure that the things that we're working on are actually growing the things that are valued. Blame sort of dissipates when there's no consequence to it. Then you just look like a whiner, right? Most of the time people are using blame because they're deflecting failure from themselves because failure has a consequence. So once we know that how we provide value so that we can mitigate the cost of failure, blame kind of dissipates on its own. It doesn't have a lot of energy. That's saying you're still dealing with people's personalities, right? And I don't talk about it in this deck, but it's always sort of on the tip of the tongue. It's like, what about the poisonous person? Because we've all dealt with them, right? And sometimes they're at a point where the only way to deal with it was to move them out of the team, and then the rest of the team is like, geez, what took you so long? Although often cracking the nut on a poisonous person is a great trust exercise, is hard work. I knew a guy that just was, he was a developer, and every problem he ever had was everybody else's fault. And I was doing the project management work, so often I was the guy figuring out where's the problem actually lie. And you could eventually convince him that it was actually his work. But it was hard to do that remote, in any remote medium. So I just started having lunch with him, and he liked barbecue, right? And so it got to a point where he would literally send me the nastygram, because he still sent me the nastygram, and I'd just respond with meat and lemonade. And then we'd meet at our favorite barbecue place to have meat and lemonade, and we'd talk through the problem, and we typically come out to it. And it actually ascended to a level. One time I said meat and lemonade, and there was a long pause. He goes, oh, wait, this is me. And then he went and fixed it. Well, I was training him to that thinking that we need to talk this through, and other people, there could be other reasons this is going wrong, right? Mainly he wanted to be heard. He was a remote worker who felt like he was perpetually shouting in the void, right? And once he had a sense that he was being heard and cared about, it tapers off. I'm not saying you can save every poisonous person, especially when there's scar tissue in a team, right? When you've had a team that's been rough for a while, sometimes folks need to go. But you should be able to answer that if you're leading, or even if you're just involved in the team, you care about influencing communication, you'll figure that out. And then you can try and decide, like, how are we going to deal with this one way or the other. Many angry tech folk that I know of are extremely smart and terrible communicators. And when you, as a project leader or someone responsible for that, can be their buffer to communication, they get better. I'm not saying good, better. And lots of spectrum folks, right? That's a very Western term, right? We try and not say Asperger's anymore, except all the Asperger's folks want us to still use it. But we spectrum, because it's an array of ways that people think and ways that people communicate, and how and their sensitivity to social interactions. And if you're interested in this influential role, getting good with spectrum folks, super useful. It's not hard. Don't look them in the eye. Listen hard to exactly what they're saying. Sit with them for an extended period of time. Presence matters to someone who's struggling with communication spectrum. Right? And I can't teach you all of that right now, but it's worth learning. If that's something you want to do, It's a skill in our industry which just attracts those folks in droves if you're dealing with them, getting good at working with them. They're happier. I know I had a couple of PMs that I worked with where the team would not work if those PMs weren't on the group. Like, so, nope, not doing that if Chuck isn't in the group. He doesn't write any code. Yeah, but he is my favorite shit umbrella. Because Chuck had a knack for making sure that everybody was actually working, building stuff they cared about and was good, and took away pain, right? He was an influential guy. He was an effective communicator, and he compensated for those differences. I don't want sameness, right? I want those differences and that we are able to value them and take advantage of them. Everybody works on the things they're great at, and the whole ends up bigger than the sum of the parts. That takes someone who really cares to try to put all those pieces together, recognize the jigsaw pieces, and put them together. One more? Anything, sir?
I just want to understand your experience coming into organisations where there might be good trust at the local level, but maybe not in the region.
Yes.
And I guess I'm wondering if that's where the influential positions come in to try and foster that upwards. So what your experience?
Well, often teams work on the trust within the team a lot and rarely work on cross-team trust. And so then we sort of get those initiatives to what influential member do we take from one team to put with an influential member of a different team and help grow the trust between those teams, right? Yeah, well, it's always up in some degree, right? You're going to have to go through something to get there, but always when you're working with a tier outside of an immediate team, they have a different value set. You need to know what it is, right? Customer value is usually a safe place to go because everybody should be working on it. You cannot, like, that's a whole other can of worms. So seeing how they fit into customer value and then knowing how to communicate with them to help them be more effective at their job, that's usually pretty compelling, right? Most of the time, people want to know that there's folks around that are helping them be better. You just got to figure out what that is, right? When you start jumping up tiers and into other teams. Sometimes folks are secretive about that too, right? And that can be a tough nut to crack. I already said last question, Adam, but I'll take one from you anyway.
Do you see correlation between people that have trust and work well in a company versus what they do in their private life?
Yeah, most of the time. It's a challenge to actually be uniform on all of that. Different people have different. Rarely do folks have a vision of what their work would be like from their childhood. Often people have visions of what their family life would be like from childhood. And so there's almost a reality distortion about what your family is like. And so there's often a continuity between that. I mean, very few of us are working in the job that we thought we'd be working at when we were in high school, right? Because didn't have a name back then. You know, those things have changed remarkably. But family has been family. And so we often have strongly held beliefs about what our family is, whether it is or not. And so that's where you often see discontinuity there, what their relationship is between a nuclear family versus a business where there's many more forces at work. And the success of a business is a pretty easy thing to measure. It typically has involved revenue. What's the success of a family look like? It's a tougher thing to measure. So, you know, typically when businesses don't have good metrics and can't measure the direction they're going in, they break apart, they fail. You're really not an option for a family because we don't have good metrics. I think it's a very tough thing to measure, success of a family and tune that. So that's where I find they're different. I would like us to be consistent in our behavior across all of our different lives. We always have a bunch of them, right? Including our digital lives. I think that's a new thing that we're dealing with our children and ourselves, having that digital identity actually line up with our physical identity. You know, there's reasons why they tend to be different. The easiest thing would they be all the same, but we don't always choose the easy path. Off topic, but not a bad one. All right, have a great next day. Thank you.